Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium. Today is Friday, August 22nd, and it's been quite a day. I woke up to the news that John Bolton's house was being raided by the FBI. Couldn't happen to a nicer person. And as people may or may not remember, it was Bolton who intervened in a despicable way to derail the North and South Korea negotiations, which President Trump was involved in his first term, which may have brought the Korean War finally to an official end. And Bolton threatened that they should use the Libya approach on North Korea, which is to say, for those of you not familiar, Gaddafi had agreed to never develop nuclear weapons. And his reward for that, for working with the United States, was to be overthrown and brutally raped and murdered, being dragged through the streets and then laughed at by Hillary Clinton. So that was Bolton. And then also Bolton, my understanding from some comments of Senator Richard Black of Virginia, retired colonel, is that Bolton also was involved in undermining President Trump's attempt to get American troops out of Syria in his first term. So this is a very nasty character. And I will say that since we last spoke on the symposium, Tulsi Gabbard has yanked the security clearance of another 37 people, many of whom were involved in the Russiagate nonsense, many of whom were involved in the support of Ukraine, probably even in some of the Ukrainian hit lists on which my name has appeared, as well as Helga Zepp-LaRouche and other people that you're familiar with. So this is very interesting. And then we also learned that apparently she gave orders that people involved in the very important negotiations between the United States and Russia, between President Trump and Putin personally, not share intelligence with our so-called allies of the Five Eyes. And I would say that what we consider our allies, particularly when it comes to the British, but most of them really are not our allies, that they want war. And then, of course, there's the Mossad as well. So the London Economist is in a complete freak out about Gabbard. You had the New York Post, which is definitely a pro-Zionist, pro-British royal rag, had an article this morning saying top diplomat says President Trump is going to be trapped by Putin. So I thought, well, the top diplomat that I know is Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia. He's probably the senior diplomat in the world, and I don't think he would be saying this. So who is it? Kaya Kallas, the little pipsqueak from Estonia who loves the Ukrainian banderist, who's now with the European Commission. It's a joke. So everything is being deployed to sabotage the extraordinary potential which emerged from the Alaska meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin, including, unfortunately, President Trump's own, if he indeed did put out the post where he said that Ukraine was going to lose because, unfortunately, they weren't allowed to defend themselves, which is really a crazy thing to say, since Biden was encouraging them to lob long-range missiles into Russia, putting the whole world in jeopardy. And, of course, the Russians reacted immediately, and Yuri Ushakov got Witkoff on the phone. Not good, but I would say we should not react to everything. This is going to be turbulent times. Clearly, it enraged a whole cast of characters that President Trump had the courage to meet with President Putin in Alaska. And we don't know the details of everything they discussed. Now, that brings me to an initiative of Helga Zepp-LaRouche, which is very important, that Presidents Trump, Putin, and Xi Jinping of China, and I believe Modi of India will also be there, but they meet at the Victory in Asia celebration, VJ Day celebration in Beijing. It's the 80th anniversary of the defeat of the fascist military Japan. And this is a very important occasion, and the United States, China, and Russia were allies in World War II fighting fascism. So it'd be a very appropriate occasion for them to meet. And therefore, I asked my colleague, Bill Jones, who is a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche and a writer and researcher for Executive Intelligence Review, to join me, because one of the things I found in the organizing is that Americans, unfortunately, know very little history. They know very little about World War II. The only thing they might know about is the landing at Normandy and that we were fighting Adolf Hitler. Hopefully they are aware of that much. They don't know anything about what happened in the Pacific, except some people who are older believe that dropping the nuclear bombs on Japan ended the war, which is really not the case. The Japanese were already defeated and in the process of surrender. And as people who've been following the material from the LaRouche organization know, my hypothesis is that those bombs were really launched to begin the war against Russia, which the British wanted. But let me be quiet and turn it over to Bill Jones, because he is going to have a lot to share, and I think people are really going to be very happy to learn about this. So Bill, please go ahead.
Thanks, Diane. Appreciate being on your program here. The situation leading up to World War II, there are two things I want to indicate: that the situation leading up to World War II, and also to give people a sense of how the anniversary this year, the 80th anniversary of the ending of the Second World War, is in China much more of an existential experience compared to what we have here. You have to understand that we had significant losses during World War II. Something like 500,000 Americans were killed, but the nation itself was never directly threatened. But countries like Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, and China, their very existence was threatened. That if the Japanese, in the case of China, had won the war, the nation of China would have basically disappeared, becoming something of a Japanese satrap. So for them, it was an existential fight of a much more intense nature than people imagine, and that's why it's going to be a lot of discussions, celebrations, movies, exhibits in China as we go into this September 3rd event and following it. I'd like to start, though, at the beginning of the last century with the first slide here to indicate a potential that was put forward for the Asia Pacific by the Russian finance minister Sergei Yulevich Witte. Witte, who had been a railroad man, who had been the head of transportation, then went to become the finance minister. And his program was, he was a follower of the American system as it was indicated by the work of Friedrich List. So he was following the path that America had taken before him, including in terms of the railroad building, where you had the Transcontinental Railroad as a model for what could be done in a country the size of Russia at the time, the size of the Russian Empire, which then, as now, extends over 11 time zones. It was difficult to get from one end to the other at that time, as one can imagine. But the creation of a railroad from the western part of Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg, all the way to Pacific coast would have changed the situation entirely, economically, culturally, for the Russian people. And that this is what Witte was successful in influencing the Tsar Alexander III to conduct, and was the one who was primarily responsible for it. For him, of course, it was not simply a matter of extending the reach of Moscow into the eastern region for defense, for economic and for other purposes, but it was also a corridor which would become something of a corridor of trade and development for the entire Asia Pacific. Trade which was conducted along the lines of the sea routes, largely controlled by the British Navy, which was ruling the sea at the time, would then go by land in a much quicker route, in which Russia, of course, would have a tremendous benefit because the transportation would go primarily through this railroad, but it would also open up new possibilities for the countries in the Asia-Pacific region, including China, including Japan. And that Witta's idea was that this would introduce a new level of development for these countries, which would also allow them to create friendly relations with Russia because it was providing that corridor for which they would have trade with Western Europe. And this was his idea. As a matter of fact, when he launched this, the railroad initially would go through Russian territory entirely, but he had the idea of extending it on a trunk which would go through Chinese Manchuria, bringing it in a much shorter route to the Pacific Ocean, but also encompassing China in this trade in a much more direct way. It was not a question of Russia taking a part of China, but rather creating this railroad, which would be controlled, I think, for 20 years by the Russians and then turned over to the Chinese, which would be a corridor of development for their own internal development. Next slide, please. Construction, of course, was not so easy. It was a difficult area, partially going through a permafrost and through a major sea route in Lake Baikal, one of the biggest internal lakes in the world. But the commitment was there, and they were intent on conducting this railroad, and we see some of the railroad workers there. Next slide, please. What happened to the map?
The map is later. You just had a slide that said fighting begins in the war.
Oh, I see. Okay. I'm sorry.
I can go to the
map. Let's do it. There's the map. Okay, we need that to get a sense of this. If you look at it on the right, if you can see that, it goes basically through all of Russia, but then there is 2 points in this particular map. There's one that goes to the northern route, which is in Russia, but then there's a more southern route which goes through Manchuria, and this was called the Chinese Eastern Railroad, and it was by and large not the first railroad was built, but the longest railroad that was built at that time. We're looking at the year around 1900, and it created a whole different set of conditions in China itself. Obviously, you had the railroad workers, you had the engineers, you had to utilize the native forces, which would make them into construction workers of a railroad rather than farmers. You also, as you were moving through there, new cities were established, including one of the biggest cities and one of the junctures of the Chinese Eastern Railroad, Harbin, which is in Manchuria, now the biggest city there, which today even maintains a lot of its Russian character in terms of the architecture and the like. This was a new element in the Chinese development, was worked in conjunction with some of the leading modernizers in China, including Li Hongchang, who at one point also visited the United States in the 1880s and was intent on trying to transform China from a primarily agricultural country to a modern industrial nation, similar to what the Japanese had done. He also, there was a lot of opposition to it, a lot of reaction from some of the powers that be that did not want to move in that direction. but that was his intent. And in addition, it was also understood that China, as a large nation, would also have to advance militarily as a modern nation, which Li Hongchang desperately tried to accomplish. We will see it didn't quite get to the point where it was very effective when it did come to war. Then we have the situation with Japan. Japan is an island nation. The biggest problem that Japan has is they do not have any or very many natural resources. As Japan emerged in the 1800s, largely due initially to the influence of the United States and the opening up of Japan with Commodore Perry, they found themselves as an industrial nation that needed supplies of materials that would not be found within Japan itself. There were two ways that they could deal with this. And there were two traditions that I even kind of exist to this day. The one route is that we can conduct trade in order to bring in what we need from the outside world. And Japanese have long been experienced traders, even into the present century. The other was that we could simply beg, borrow, or steal from other nations, and as they became more industrialized and did create a military force, they could also do that through wars of attrition, of taking areas. So you had those two factions, one which is kind of the military side and the others which is more oriented towards the diplomatic side. Witte, of course, had support from leading people within this new modern Japan when they had created the Emperor Meiji and overcame the localisms that existed there, creating Japan as a nation, that there were forces there who were interested in moving in that direction, who would see Witte's program as a means of resolving their problems. One of those people was Ito Hirobumi, who had been instrumental in the revolt that led to the creation of Meiji Japan. But there were others who had very different views. You also had, unfortunately in Japan, almost from the get-go, a strong British presence. The engineering schools that were set up in Japan were set up by British naval officers who had also been involved in setting up similar engineering schools in India, which of course was already a British colony. And of course, that meant that the British influence in Japan was very strong. The British had the attitude, as we know from our history, that they were an island kingdom that controlled the seas, but you had this Eurasian heartland, which was much more powerful, with countries like Russia, like Germany, like France. If they got together, they would become the major factors in development, not the British. Therefore, the British saw themselves as linking up with the Japanese as the two island kingdoms on the edge of this Eurasian heartland, which could work together in order to advance their own interests. And that played a role, as we will see moving forward. There were, however, an element in Japan that realized that they were the major military power at a certain point in the Asia-Pacific region, and they could use that power to move forward and to assert their own interests. The first problem came, the first conflict came over the issue of Korea. Korea was they were under Chinese sovereignty, so that they paid a tribute to China. At a certain point, the Chinese even controlled Korea, but by the 1800s, they were pretty much an independent nation. They were in fact recognized as an independent nation by the United States. I think it was in 1882, even before they had officially freed themselves from Chinese sovereignty. And as a matter of fact, I think we were able to do that in collaboration with elements of the Chinese government. we had an ambassador there, and a Korean ambassador came to the United States in the 1880s. So they were on a road to independence. The Japanese were involved economically, and Japan saw Korea as a means of attaining a foothold on the continent, which would allow them access to the raw materials that were extant, not in Japan, but to some extent in Korea, but more importantly in China. And there were a number of forces working there. The Russians had an influence in Korea at that time, the Chinese, the Japanese. At a certain point, the Japanese successfully created a peasant revolt, which led to the overthrow of the legitimate king in Korea, because China still had suzerainty with Korea. They were called in by the king to come and to undo this revolt that was going on. As soon as Chinese troops landed in Korea, the Japanese then began their move against the Chinese. China had also begun building a navy. It had a military forces. It had been actually allied with some of the Civil War veterans who had helped them in building an army, but they were not at the level of the Japanese. And the war began between Japan and China, largely in Korea, and partially in mainland China. And the Chinese were successful in overcoming the Chinese in that war. We have three pictures here from the Japanese archives. Next slide, showing, or next slide that was going to be shown. Yes, this is the battle, I believe. This is the beginning of the war. Then next slide. This is one of the battles, and I don't see the title I think it's South Korea, the Battle of Asan, I think that was. I don't see the title. And the next slide. This is, I think, Pyongyang, which of course not today is the capital of North Korea, and that was also taken by the Japanese. And then the third slide shows you the destruction of the Chinese fleet. The Chinese had a problem. Li Hongchang, who was really responsible for the creation of the Chinese Navy, had always to fight the Empress, who used the money that was available for building the ships to build what today is a marble ship that is in the water near the Summer Palace. Now, because it's in marble, it doesn't float, so it doesn't go anywhere. But it is simply there as a tourist site. But for the Empress, this was something that would create, a prestige for the imperial throne, and therefore the money went to that instead of to the Navy, which is why there was this defeat. So as a result of that war, the Japanese successfully gained gained Taiwan, and they gained the Pescador Islands, which had previously been a part of the Chinese Empire. They also had a third claim to a part of mainland China called the Liaodong Peninsula. Next slide. And this is very critical. It's critical because it was the first territory in China that Japan would control. And it was also key, as you see, it is a peninsula there. You see Korea to the right and the Liaodong Peninsula to the left. And it was an important port as well. And that was very much desired by the Japanese. But the Russians under Witte, and they were observing these developments very, very seriously, because it would affect the whole program of Witte in terms of the Asia Pacific region. And he was successful in bringing the Germans and the French, which also at that point had had not colonies, but they had interests in the Asia Pacific and interest in China. And they did not want to see a division of China. It was felt that the annexation of this peninsula would be just the first step in the breakup of China. So he got the three of them together to put pressure on the Japanese to relinquish the Liaodong Peninsula, which the Japanese did do. But they were extremely upset about that, and upset about that, especially with regard to the Russian role in bringing together this kind of a coalition. This was remembered for a long time in Japan, and Emperor Hirohito, at the end of World War II, when he was forced to sign the peace treaty, he took up the issue of, he says, I'm in the same type of position as the Japanese emperor was in when he signed the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which was the treaty in which Japan abrogated claims to the Liaodong Peninsula. So, but there was also enmity with regard to Russia as a result of this. There was also a concern that Russia, which was building this railroad in Manchuria, was also gaining access to a part of China which would not be accessible to the Japanese. And of course, while Witt's policy was that the Japanese and the Chinese would be included in this development program, there were elements in Russia in the military complex that really wanted simply to annex Manchuria. And they were also gaining the ear of the Tsar, who was very strongly anti-Japanese since he had visited the Far East even before he took the throne. And there was an assassination attempt. He was knifed by a Japanese terrorist. So he had his own problems with the Japanese, and he was not at all friendly to them, which created a situation of great enmity. The Japanese, therefore, at this point decided that they would begin to move also against Russia. And you had in 1904, 1905, shortly after the Treaty of Shimonoseki, it was 1897, just several years later, then you had the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War, trying to bring down the power of the Russian Empire in China. Nobody really thought that the Japanese would have any chance in this war, given that the general prejudice was that a European nation, and Russia, which was in many respects a European nation, would therefore have the upper hand. That was not the case, and it was a very difficult war for them. As a matter of fact, their fleet on the Pacific region suffered major defeats, and they called the Baltic Fleet to come to the Pacific Ocean in order to relieve the forces in the Russian Navy. And that took them a while because they had to go from the Baltic all the way around Europe and around, I think, Cape of Good Hope to get to the Pacific region. And when they did come, next slide, they were moving towards the area of where there was fighting going on, and they moved their ships one by one through this little strait that we see here called the Strait of Tsushima. And as they went one by one, you see you have the Korea on one side and Japan on the other side. Japanese had occupied that part of Korea. So as each of these ships came through that strait, they were destroyed one by one. So that the Baltic Fleet, which had come to the rescue of the Russian Pacific Fleet, was totally destroyed in the famous Battle of Tsushima. So they won that war. There was a peace conference that was negotiated by that Anglophile friend Theodore Roosevelt. It wasn't entirely as bad as it could have been. Witte was able to save the northern part of Sakhalin Island. The southern part went to the Japanese, but more importantly, they received in that treaty, they really received control over Korea. So they had already moved in there. More importantly, they also won the rights to run the railroad in Manchuria, which previously had been a Russian under Russian control, and that was their first foothold on Chinese soil, was then in the control of this railroad in Manchuria. But it wasn't long before, as they consolidated their situation in Manchuria, they created an incident by 1931 where there was a bombing of the railroad, or this railroad which was being run then, which was going actually through the Liaodong Peninsula that we saw earlier to the sea, to the seaport at Port Arthur. There was a bombing there, and the Japanese then used that as a pretext to basically take over all of Manchuria. There was, first of all, a Chinese official that was in charge of it. He was basically overthrown, and the Japanese took Manchuria. Then they began to build up their own military forces for larger moves that were intended for the area of China proper. And during the time they were in Manchuria, Manchuria at the time was, of course, probably the most industrialized part of China, since the Russians, with the development of the railroad, had also contributed to creating something of an industrial society around the railroad. Japanese took it over. They didn't dismantle it. They didn't destroy it, but they used it to their advantage. It was during this period that the Japanese were also working on new types of weaponry, and there will be a movie, I believe, coming out soon, where the Chinese will show the development of the Japanese chemical and biological weapons program, which was developed even before the Japanese entered into China proper. Before they tried the invasion of China and taking over Beijing, they had already developed the chemical and biological weapons that they intended to use in their invasion of Japan already in Manchuria. And this is also something that people generally don't know. So they found another pretext at the famous Marco Polo Bridge in 1937, and there was an alleged shooting between Chinese and Japanese soldiers. Marco Polo Bridge was like the border between Manchuria and China proper, and therefore, when that happened, the shooting happened, and the Chinese used that as a pretext to move into China, to take Beijing.
You mean the Japanese?
I'm sorry, the Japanese, yeah, used that as a pretext to move into Beijing. Next picture, we see that. The one before that, yeah, here you see them moving their troops into China. Next slide. You have to see what it is. Yeah. No, I can't. Oh, okay. Oh, go back to the other slide. Go back to the other slide. Okay. It was easy to take Beijing. The Chinese forces, were not at the same level technologically as the Japanese were. There was, even at that time, support and sympathy from the United States, but it was not the type that allowed them to build their military to any great extent. So that Beijing was taken rather quickly. They moved south then. There was a battle in Shanghai. The battle in Shanghai, however, I mean, the Chinese forces one should understand the attitude also that people today in China have toward that overall battle. Of course, now it is the Chinese Communist Party thinks, of course, a lot of, the role that they played, but they also understand, there is general understanding today in China that the bulk of the opposition to the Japanese was the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek. We will see, I know, during the celebrations that are coming up now on September 3rd, that there will also be a recognition of those troops, of the role that they played. Like the forces of the communist resistance, there are probably not a whole lot of them still alive, but to the extent that they are, they will be honored, and also the relatives of those who fought in the Kuomintang will have a similar status as those who fought in the Chinese in the communist resistance because of the importance of this. And in Shanghai, they really proved their worth, that the Japanese thought that they would simply sweep through Shanghai and take it over without, significant losses. That was not the case. And there was a lot of bitterness on the part of the Japanese because of the tremendous resistance that the Chinese showed. So in the next battle, in the next move that they fought from Shanghai, they moved inland along the Yangtze River up to Nanjing.
I just wanted to show this map because I think people are having.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
The geography. So can you see that?
I can't. Oh, yeah. Now I see it. Yes. Yes, this is the map of what the Japanese, if I recall, if I know it correctly, the Japanese controlled in 1940. They would control a little more, but not a whole lot more. And so that you see that it's a large country. The Chinese forces, after putting up a resistance, as they were defeated, then they moved eastward, and they took with them their universities. They took, a lot of their precious goods and things treasures that they didn't want devastated by the Japanese, and they moved it inland. So you had new universities that were set up, in places like Chongqing and Guangdong, which didn't have universities before. So in one sense, it was a spreading of the knowledge that was forced by this Japanese invasion. But they never did the entire country. And the Battle of Shanghai created a lot of bitter feeling in the Japanese. So at the next battle in Nanjing, it was the intention of the Japanese that we must show the Chinese what they are worth, that they are less than human. First of all, the principle was that every soldier will be killed. And so part of what happened in the Battle of Nanjing is that everybody would be investigated whether they were a soldier. And if they looked as if they were at the age, males at the age of being a soldier, they just took it for granted that they are soldiers and were automatically killed. But the amount of rapine and devastation and just evilness took its peak in this Battle of Nanjing. And I'll show you a number of pictures, not the worst of them all, to indicate what it was actually happening. And this is just like a total devastation of entire groups of people. Nanjing also had its area where people could be safe. There's the international area, and that for a long time that was maintained kind of sacrosanct, but at a certain point that also was devastated. And we see here.
What was the population of Nanjing at that time?
I don't know.
It was a substantial city.
Nanjing was probably the third largest city after Beijing, Shanghai. Nanjing was undoubtedly the third largest city. Nanjing, of course, had an old history because Nanjing at one point had been the capital city of China for a while under the republic in the 1900s, but it also stretched earlier too during the Taiping Rebellion. So I don't know. I'd have to Google that right now, but I can't do it. But it was the third largest city, and of course it was even larger because all the refugees, including a lot of the soldiers who retreated after the Battle of Shanghai, also found their refuge in Nanjing. And we'll see this. This is one example, but next slide, you'll see this. Yeah, he's just on the steps. They were just killed inadvertently. And the third slide, which we won't see this until we see what happened at Auschwitz and Treblinka. Nothing like this, I don't think, really has ever been seen, at least not in the photographic era. And that was what we were dealing with here. There is a film that I would like to recommend, which is in the theaters now, called Dead to Rights, which is a film actually about the Nanjing photo studio, which tells the very interesting and dramatic story about how these photos, which were photos that were done by the Japanese in order to hype up their own soldiers to further feats of the same nature, and possibly also to let their bosses back home know that they were doing a good job in sweeping up, this Chinese scum. But it was by no means allowed that these pictures would in any way be sent out to the Western press, because they knew that this would be a total uproar in the international community. And so what the film shows is the real story of how people who were actually hiding at this photo studio, some were, and some were actually forced to work for the Japanese, but others were there hiding. The photo studio was necessary because the Japanese could take the film, but developing it and like they couldn't do on site, and they wanted to have it for their own troops as well, and therefore they had to use the Chinese who were working there, and they in turn saw to it that they were able to squirrel away the worst photos and replace them in the archives with other photos, so that at a certain point they felt they could get them out to the West, which they did very shortly. And that created a furor over the situation, leading to large condemnation of the Japanese operations in Nanjing. It is still today a problem. I mean, it's understood by the Chinese what happened there, but in terms of the Japanese society as a whole, these movies will not be shown. And there was an article today, which will be in our briefing tomorrow. Hopefully we'll get some circulation, by a Japanese blogger who saw the movie and who was so upset about it that he put on his blog, which usually had like lighthearted stuff. He lived in China, he's a Japanese, but he's a blogger and he blogs in Chinese. But he generally has very easygoing stuff, jokes and things like that. But he had a very serious, blogging in terms of the implications of this, and concern that it still is not recognized at all by the Japanese that this actually happened. And therefore their view of the Japanese soldiers and the Japanese army in World War II is still totally obfuscated and oblivious to the actual damage that actually was done. Perhaps in this anniversary era, where we have a film of this and we have the film of the biological warfare factories that people don't know about, this will change the situation in Japan. And because as of today, as there was earlier, there are two very clear factions in Japan. There are those who know that it is trade and development cooperation that is important, And there are those who are still stuck in the past, still visit the various Yasukuni shrines, thinking that these are war heroes, noble souls, so to speak. And but that can all change quickly. But I want to end on a optimistic note here, that, and kind of returning to what we had in the beginning. It's the other one. Yeah, that's it. Is especially now that the area of the Far East to some extent has been focused on through the Anchorage meeting of Putin and Trump in Alaska. It has also raised interest again in this old project, which the Tsar Nicholas II, who had been knifed by the Japanese terrorist in 1905, gave the permission to an American company, which had a project of building a bridge and perhaps even a tunnel over the Bering Strait, which you see is very short. I think it's about 80 miles. The closest between the U.S. and Russia are these two islands in the middle of the Bering Strait, which are I think 4 kilometers from each other. One is, of course, American. The other is, of course,
We lost Bill for a moment. I think he'll be back.
You have the map?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll go to this one.
Okay. If you see the map, now this means that this discussion went on to some extent in the news media, even the Russian press is talking about this old project of the Bering Strait tunnel and bridge, which we have been promoting now for the last 40 years, and have been talking with engineers about it. But it's an older project. It dates back to the beginning of the 1900s. I don't know if you got what I said about Tsar Nicholas II, who was knifed by the Japanese terrorists, allowed an American company which had a project to build a bridge and a tunnel over the Bering Strait. He allowed them to do it, but he gave them no money, and obviously that didn't pan out. But that's a project. If it is accomplished, then you see that you have a land bridge between all of continental North America and all of Eurasia. And by Eurasia, I mean not only into Russia, but also down to China. And of course, that would create the type of development where, the factions in Japan who know that trade and development is important would understand the significance of this, but also all the other, peoples in the region. And I think it's important to emphasize that at this time and place, because Alaska now has become a matter of interest to people, that there is hopefully continuation of this relationship, which now has largely been reestablished between Russia and the United States, in which this project can be developed not only to the benefit of the people in the various regions there close by it, but also to the rest of the world connected to it by rail and other traffic, because that would be a step upwards in the development of a global land bridge, which will bring trade and development to all of the world. And hopefully in the aftermath of this remembrance of World War II and a remembrance of the agreements that we had after World War II, which to some extent are being forgotten, we can use that type of climate in order to reinvigorate the situation so that we can get back to the kind of program that Sergei Witt and others like him had over 100 years ago.
Great. Well, thank you. This brings to mind a couple of questions, because I'm thinking about the September 2nd surrender of the Emperor Hirohito on the USS Missouri. Were the Chinese there? I just remembered
General Douglas MacArthur receiving this. But what was the relationship of the Chinese to this? It seems to me they suffered the most at the hands of the Japanese.
That's true. My impression is, I don't know the actual history of that, but my impression is that the formal, not apology, but the formal surrender to China came in the wake of the Missouri situation. They're celebrating it on September 3rd. So obviously something happened on September. I really should know it, and I will look it up after this, but I think something happened after that, which made September 3rd, the key for them, right?
Yeah, interesting. And when we saw these horrific images from what is called the rape of Nanjing by the Japanese, this horrific slaughter, it makes me wonder, with regard to the atrocities being committed by the IDF in Gaza right now, how history deals with these things. Because I think in South Africa, they took one approach which clearly was effective, the truth and reconciliation idea, which is not revenge, but also you must acknowledge the crimes that were committed. I think it's very hard to move forward if you don't acknowledge that hideous crimes were committed. We had at the end of after the war in Europe, you had the Nuremberg tribunals, and people were on a certain level had to come to terms with the crimes, although not really, as we know, the whole history of that and all the people and various financial interests involved. But what are your thoughts about this situation now? You said a little bit, but
well, look, there were trials of the Japanese. There's a book out called what do they call it? It's similar to the book on Nuremberg that it was put out, I think, about a year ago. Judgment. It's called Judgment of Tokyo, right? Which goes through that. So it was generally recognized, and a lot of these guys were executed for war crimes, right? Including people responsible for the Nanjing massacre. There might have also been.
Arthur does talk about that in his reminiscences.
Who does that?
General MacArthur, yeah, he did not particularly, I think, like the death penalty, but he said there was certain, of course, he insisted that they could not touch the emperor or harm the emperor. But there was one case I remember where he describes feeling some discomfort. And he said, no, we had to establish a standard of justice, and therefore you had to go after some of these war criminals. The crimes that they committed were so hideous. There would be no faith in the system of justice if you ignored what had been done by, and I forget who the particular individual was.
Yeah, I don't know. I think within the general culture, of course, because you still have this, this Yasukuni shrine issue that comes up almost every year, and nobody's really kind of contested that to any great extent. That you have generally on the part of the Japanese the attempt to really kind of forget the whole thing and ignore it, which causes a lot of problems. Although there probably have been, I would say by many Japanese officials, apologies to this, simply because they wanted to maintain, because they were either apologetic or they just wanted to maintain good trade relations with countries like Korea and Japan, which were on the backside of these operations. But it's hard to say how that's going to be resolved culturally in Japan. I think one of the important things about these films that are coming out, especially there's one on Nanjing, and people have commented on that. When you see this, you reflect also on what's going on in Gaza, right? And that's important. It's important that people, look back on what we rejected at that time in order to reflect again on what's going on now. And hopefully, if people go to the film, and I hope a lot of people do, that will have that effect. But in terms of the Japanese situation, I think there probably have been apologies at various levels, even on the official, with regard to this thing. But to some extent, I think they, in terms of the culture, movies, books and things like that, there's probably not a lot being written on in Japan. But I'm just not more closely acquainted with the Japanese situation to say much more on that.
Well, the 80th anniversary, this commemoration on September 3rd, certainly is a very, very big deal. What's your sense about what China might be reflecting on, and what message might they be trying to share with the rest of the world by doing this? There will be an enormous display of military equipment, I think.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think they will be, of course, showing, the strength of China, but they will also be, I think, emphasizing the notion, of the need of cooperation and harmony, which has been the leitmotif of Chinese policy, for the last decades and even longer than that. I think there will be also an attempt to kind of straighten, kind of get out the real history to people. I know it's interesting thing going on actually at the embassy here is that they're looking at the support that existed even at an early stage, even before the United States entered the war, to the Chinese from the U.S. side. And when they have their National Day at the end of September, I think they're going to have an exhibit with a lot of things that their scholars at the embassy had discovered about, who was supporting China during the 1930s and early 1940s. One of the things I think they found, which was interesting, was that Walt Disney that had published or maybe had on film a picture of Mickey Mouse together with a little Chinese figure, which was popularly known by all Chinese children at that time. And he had them together and put it out in some form to show, the sense of solidarity. And I think there was a lot of it, in spite of the fact we didn't enter the war until 1941, that the works of Edgar Snow, and he was there from the get-go. He wrote a book, and his first book in 1933 was called The Far Eastern Front. And it was all about this Mukden incident. He was there at the time. I mean, he was talking.
And who is Edgar Snow?
Edgar Snow was an American journalist. Oh, you don't know him. He was very famous. He was an American journalist who was in China for, I guess, 20 years. And became very close to Mao, and he wrote the Red Star over China, which is
okay.
You probably read that.
I've heard of that. I haven't read it. I only know the name of it.
And he also, as a signal to the U.S. around, I guess, the 1970s, early 1970s or late 1960s, Edgar Snow was invited to a major Tiananmen Square event, I guess National Day, to send a signal to the United States that China would not be unhappy if the United States began to establish relations with them, and that was because everybody knew who he was. But he was there at an early stage, and he knew the Japanese. He knew the Japanese who were in charge of this Mukden incident, and he wrote about it in this book, The Far Eastern Front, which was primarily on that. And I had a copy of it. I got it at a secondhand bookstore, but I looked on Amazon to see if it was available, and the only issue I found was $400.
Wow!
So I think it's now very rare. But his other books are, of course, more prevalent. But
right.
But those kind of things, they're going to try and do that, because I think what they want to do especially on the United States. That's why they're putting these movies out. You know, I'm sure they're doing it in Europe as well, but there's a big concentration on the situation here because they do want to maintain, they do want to establish a much better relationship with the U.S., that they will make an effort to underline, and they have been doing that for years, the U.S.-Chinese collaboration during World War II, and that's very significant.
Right. Yeah, and that does bring back, and I'm just going to bring back the map of this Bering Strait crossing again, because you really see why the Chinese in particular would be so interested in this. Because, and also I will just say, the obvious thing is if you look at this map, you see the west coast of the United States, Canada, Alaska, the Russian Federation, and then you see Korea, Japan, and you don't have to go through Europe, which I think is a great advantage, because right now that is like I don't know what they are, a bunch of backward warmongers. So it changes the relationship of everything on the planet if we would orient this way.
It's also the case that the great bulk of international production now is in the Asia Pacific region by and large, and they all are our neighbors. We're just separated by a little bit of water.
Right. Right. Exactly. So I think I would urge everyone to look on the Schiller Institute website and add your name to the appeal launched by Helga Zepp-LaRouche that these three presidents have got to meet in Beijing. I think this is very important. And Bill, I'll just go to you if you have any concluding thoughts on this.
Well, I would just urge people to try and get a better picture of what actually, you know, China was historically to us, but also what's going on there at this point as well. You know, and I wrote a book about this. I won't hawk the book here because I don't want to be a commercial, but I have been taking that like to book fairs and the like to talk.
Why don't you say what the name of your book is?
Yeah, the name of the book is The Rise of China and the Return of Global Development. And the basis of it is that, you know, with the Belt and Road, history changed, right? Development again was on the table for everybody, and the Chinese, you know, wanted it on there and you know, encouraged that. But I've been talking to people on that, and it's very difficult. You see, you know, getting that issue on the table is difficult when you mention China. Some people are not necessarily, you know, antagonistic to them, but it's just like something that is not, you know, of interest to them or of importance to them. And I think it is becoming very important, because whatever you want to say about, you know, reviving the U.S. economy and things like that, it's not going to be done in rivalry with China, because they got more people and they've got more, they've really got more understanding of how to do this. And they got that from us, but we've forgotten it, right?
Right.
And we have to kind of get back to that. But but cooperating with them, which they want to do, would more quickly revive the U.S. economy. And the Chinese on this trade thing, the Chinese clearly say, you know, that we would like to buy more from you, but the things we want to buy, you won't sell us. And
do we even produce them? I mean, we seem to produce so little. What do we produce that they want to buy from us?
Well, there's a lot of mainly high technology stuff. It's not so much, but they would of course buy our soybeans, which they used to do.
Right.
The problem there is because we put up restrictions. Now they've gone to Brazil.
Right.
And since they have that relationship with Brazil, it's going to be very hard for them to say, you know, thanks and go on to something else. So we shot ourselves in the foot on the soybeans to some extent. But there are other things that we can provide. I mean, you would have to, you know, really lower the limitations of what you consider, you know, technology that cannot go to the Chinese, including semiconductors and stuff. They'll do it on their own otherwise. But by cooperating with us, you not only send them things, but you create the lines of communication in which the people who are working on these things can interchange and stimulate the ideas of making these things better. I mean, that's always been the case, right? The idea of this isolated, institution with people working on their own and no contact with other scientists doesn't really work. You have to have this exchange that will be beneficial and will be more beneficial to the United States than going on our own because of because of what they've achieved now, right? And they're willing to share that, right?
Yes. Yes.
Us, right?
Exactly. Well, I wish the United States would be celebrating the defeat of fascism in Europe and in Asia, and that might encourage us to remember something about our own identity and mission. Oh, and I did want to add one other comment, because you mentioned FDR had these ideas and he gave certain promises to the Generalissimo, I guess Chiang Kai-shek and Stalin, about the end of the war, one of which I believe was that the Chinese were adamant that they didn't want the British to be the first to sail into their harbor somewhere. And after FDR died, of course, everything got thrown out. Truman came in, and I think the violation of all of these promises that FDR made was one of the reasons why his son, Elliot Roosevelt, wrote that book As He Saw It, which came out only in 1946. Mm-hmm. So not even a year after the war ended in both Europe and the Pacific. And what Elliot Roosevelt saw, having been in so many meetings with his father, was that the most important core principles that his father had envisioned for the post-war world were already in jeopardy. And he says that in the epilogue to the book about this is why I had to write this, because my father had a vision for what the world was going to look like, and it's been violated. And I think that vision very much was shared by Lyndon LaRouche. Not that he ever got to talk to Franklin Roosevelt about it, but clearly was one of the compelling factors why Lynn did what he did in his life.
And if we get that Bering Strait tunnel and bridge built, it will largely be due to his efforts in putting that issue forward during the course of his own career.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope everyone has found this very enlightening. It was definitely interesting to me. I always wondered about all these various wars that came prior, and that was some help. So thank you.
Too many of them, but there's a red thread.
Yes, unfortunately.
Okay.
Thank
you for
very
having me.